computer. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Sarah Rowan.
Okay, welcome everyone. Is Tom Campbell, has he joined yet, Victoria?
No.
No, okay. All right, well, welcome everyone. This is our bi-weekly COVID-19 ECHO series serving the Mountain States, so welcome. And today we'll be talking about the incredibly timely topic of vaccines and vaccine distribution for COVID-19 in our region. So just a reminder, the topic changes every session. The next session will be about COVID-19 management and prevention in congregate settings. So be sure to tune in for that. And we welcome suggestions about topics as well. So feel free to send those to Victoria or to put them in the chat. So moving on, as our presenters speak, we encourage you to submit questions into the chat. And then of course, we can also do questions live as soon as the presentations are over. So either hold your questions and then ask them, or you can put them into the chat. So before we get started, we want to acknowledge this collaboration between the National Emerging Special Pathogen Training and Education Center, NETDC, Denver Health, the Denver Public Health Prevention Training Center, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Project ECHO. My name is Sarah Rowan, and I'm an infectious disease doctor at Denver Public Health. My co-MC is Karen Wendell, and she's also infectious disease at Denver Health. So I will turn it over to Victoria for a quick tech check, and then we will start with our two presentations.
Thank you. So as always, we are recording these sessions, so they will be uploaded to the website at the end of today. So you all will get that link. Just a quick other announcements is in your lower left corner, you're either going to see mute or unmute. If you are muted, it will say unmute. If you are not muted, you'll see mute. So you can go ahead and click that button when you have questions or want to add any comments to our discussion today. Next to that is the start video or stop video, again, depending if you're on video or not. If you see start video, go ahead and click that for us. We love to see your faces. It makes us much more interactive for all of us. Down a little bit, you're going to see the chat function. If everybody will go ahead and put where they're calling in from, we can get a nice sense of how far our reach has gone today. And it also helps our presenters know where people are at around our region. And that is coincidentally where you will also put any questions or comments that you all have for our presenters and experts today. Down from that, you'll see reactions. You can also go ahead and give thumbs up or claps if you agree with something that is being said. You can also give a virtual thumbs up too as well. That is all I have, so please feel free to chat me if you have any questions or you're having any sort of tech issues. As always, I will also put our website in the chat so that way you can all have that for your convenience of where our materials will be uploaded to. Back to you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. We are slated to have two presentations today. One of our presenters hasn't signed on yet. We also have two additional panelists. So we're fortunate to have three to four experts here today with us. And so since Dr. John Douglas is here, we'll start with his presentation. John Douglas is the Executive Director at Tri-County Health Department, and he will be discussing the Colorado Vaccine Distribution Plan. Thank you very much, John.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you, Sarah. Let's see if I can do this right. We just practiced it. Gosh, it's popped away again. I don't understand this. So, let me try this one more time. This is, since I used to be affiliated with and to run the training center, this is really embarrassing. By the time I figure this out, Tom Campbell will probably be here. Okay. All right, I think I got it. So Dr. Campbell is going to tell you all about the backstory on vaccines. Tom ran the clinical trial for Moderna at CU Anschutz and is really a national expert on this, but we're going to fast forward. So if you've been listening to the news, my talk may be what you've already heard on NPR or the New York Times or whatever. it's about vaccine distribution. And I mean, this is, as Victoria and Sarah said, like hugely timely. So US gets its first vaccine shipped out yesterday. And we got folks getting, as the Brits put it, jabs in the arm. We got more flowing this week and more jabs in the arm this week. And of all the difficult parts of the pandemic response, the hundreds of thousands of deaths, worst in the world for the US, the frankly, to put it mildly, ineffective national leadership from an overall leadership perspective. One incredibly bright spot has been the development of vaccines. So FDA last week reviewed the Pfizer application. Advisory committee approves an EUA on Thursday. FDA approves an EUA formally Friday night, under threat, by the way, of the commissioner being fired if he didn't get it done, just to add to the bizarreness of the whole story. ACIP meets over the weekend and releases an approval for recommendations they'd already developed by Sunday, which led to the vaccines being shipped out Sunday and Monday. So now I like to sort of think, oh, warp speed, it really worked fast, and it really did work fast, although the Canadians and the Brits, and even I think Bahrain, moved a little faster than the US without having formal warp speed. But there's no question that where the US, I think, shined was in our basic biomedical sciences, supporting the development of platforms, RNA virus, messenger RNA platforms that led to the development of both the Pfizer and the Moderna product. This is, however, the last slide said the beginning of the end, and part of the reason we're not at the very end is, number one, we don't have yet, of course, enough vaccine for everybody, and number two, this is going to be logistically challenging to give out. And I want to talk for a few minutes about at least three of the challenges. One is the allocation formulas. Second is the matter of trust. Are people really going to accept the vaccine? And third is the challenges of delivery logistics. So this is what CDC's advisory committee put together in early December, and this is what they blessed last weekend. And this is their initial phase 1 set of buckets. And they blessed phase 1 buckets, including healthcare, phase 1A rather, healthcare personnel and long-term care facility residents. Phase 1B in ACIP's recommendations were essential workers, education sector, food and ag, utilities, police, firefighters, other first responders, transportation workers, et cetera. And then finally, 1C is at-risk folks, older, 65 plus, and those with comorbidities. This is 1 as opposed to 2, which would be the more general population. Nationally, we've got about estimated 21 million people in the healthcare personnel bucket, and about 3 million people living in skilled nursing, assisted living, or other residential care facilities. So about 24 million people nationally that fall into one of those phase 1A categories. The analog in Colorado, by the way, is estimated to be about 186,000 healthcare workers and about 47,000 long-term care facility residents. Those are not super precise, but they're sort of ballparks as we begin to think about planning what we'll be doing. Now, Colorado has been working on its own allocation formula for at least 6 months and came out with one in October that was part of Colorado's vaccine plan that was submitted to CDC. This was modified somewhat last week. I'm going to show you just the last week's version. And it's fairly similar to CDC, certainly the highest risk bucket, 1A, which in Colorado sort of got its allocated by season. We would like to move as fast as possible, but we think that over the winter, we'll be getting to the 1A people, healthcare workers, and long-term care facility staff and residents. We've got a slightly different 1B in Colorado, and I would point out that the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices recommendations are just that. They are recommendations. And in our federalistic system, they've been deemed to be guidelines for the state, but not mandatory. And so at least preliminarily, Colorado says 1B is not essential workers, but it's the rest of the healthcare workers who have less direct COVID contact, workers in home health, hospice, and dental, and then first responders. We don't include other essential workers until we get into the springtime phase 1B. And we've got a ton of people sort of in one bucket together. We've got the older folks, the comorbidity, those with comorbidities, and then essential workers working directly with the public, grocery store, school, high density settings, workers serving people that live in high density settings, other healthcare workers not covered in phase 1, and placebo recipients in early trials. And then finally, our phase 3, which we would hope would begin before the summer, but it probably won't, as everybody else. This is subject to change because honestly, phase 2 is so big, we're going to probably have to do some sub-allocation within that. And I suspect that we will fall back on an original allocation framework to do that. But my suspicions may not be correct because we've already made some major deviations from that. Ultimately, the governor of the state is the final decider. And although the governor's expert emergency epidemic response committee, the GERC, came up with recommendations, the governor chose to use some and not others. There has been some controversy and probably will continue to be controversy about allocation. I see that I think most of us are from Colorado, so everybody knows the Denver Post, shadow of its former self, by the way, but still, covers the news around the metro area in Colorado. And we're already seeing controversies pop up. Not surprisingly, Mike Johnson, who was a former Senate Majority Leader in the Colorado legislature and a former candidate for governor, now is leading the Gary Community Investment Foundation, which supports education. And Mike argues that educators should be, top priority among essential workers, which frankly, many of us in public health agree with. Everybody who faces the public is essential, but our schools have just been badly stalled out. And I think there are really good arguments for educators being first. A particularly irritating allocation question came up over folks in congregate care settings. George Brockler, a former, still current district attorney in in the 18th Judicial District in Colorado, put out a blistering piece about 2 weeks ago saying that the allocation framework that put folks living in congregate care facilities, particularly prisoners, over the elderly was just mistaken. That was apparently persuasive enough that the governor agreed with him. And so while GERC had originally said prisoners ought to be high, not because they're more deserving, but frankly, because they're not less deserving and because they live in circumstances where outbreaks have been really frequent and very hard to control given the circumstances of those kind of settings. So I don't know how that one's going to play out currently. Again, prisoners are not ranked highly, but these are just two examples of some visible conversations that are likely to occur, which brings us into the issue of trust. And I think everybody's aware that we've got a healthy anti-vax movement in this country. And the anti-vax movement is already preemptively addressing COVID in a somewhat negative way. We've also got the fact that historically many vulnerable communities of color may have concerns about either trusting the government, given all the immigration conversation over the last 4 years, or may have historic reasons for not trusting government medical research. That's particularly true in the African-American community, given the still resonant Tuskegee event. I think if you're African-American in the US, you may not know what Tuskegee dealt with. It was syphilis and penicillin, but it was awful. And then we had a recent reminder of that with the story of Henrietta Lacks, who was an African-American woman whose cervical cancer cells were used for cell lines and never being informed about it. So you've got a lot of mistrust in that community. This is data from the Pew Research Center. This was back in September. And I'm showing you this because it's a little dated as data, but it shows you that we have willingness to accept vaccines that, number one, went down between the first Pew poll in May and the next Pew poll in September. September, of course, was in the heart of the election season, and you were getting all kinds of flaky claims made about how soon vaccines were going to be ready, that frankly was undermining a lot of people's trust. So in every group, willingness went down, even though the news was getting better and better. I mean, we didn't have any phase 3 results yet, but we had a lot of promising phase 2 results and rapid enrollment. So it should have been getting better, but it got so politicized that it went down. Men were more willing than women. Older folks were more willing than younger folks. Asian, Hispanic, and whites were more willing than African Americans. And the more highly educated you were, the more willing you were to receive it. I can't tell for you if the right part of the slide is blocked out, but the right graph on here shows that there is a distinct difference by political party. Republicans in September, only 44% willing. That was versus 56% for Democrats. Those had both fallen as well. Now, this is the most recent Pew data. This came out, interestingly, about 2 days after the first Pfizer announcement. So there was really good news in the air. And we did see a bump, 60%. That's the number you probably hear quoted about willingness to get the vaccine. That's the blue graph on the right side. The green below that is would not, and it adds up to, as you would expect, almost 100%. It's interesting, though, in the green part of the histogram, that's divided into those who say they are pretty certain they wouldn't get it. That's about half of that green group, maybe about 20% overall. And you've got about half, 46%, who say, yeah, I might, depending. And I think that's right now the persuadable group. So if you add those two together, and I don't think any of those are static. I mean, if the news starts looking really good, I suspect the willingness will grow. If we get more unexpected adverse reactions, the first day that the Brits gave vaccine to national health workers, 2 people with a history of severe allergic reactions had a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine. I think if we get more unexpected news like that, because we're giving it to populations that may not have been part of the very, very large, by the way, phase 3 studies, Tom will tell you about that, then we could see some unexpected things. So this is where we stand nationally now. And although we don't have recent Colorado data, this is from the end of September, when nationally we were, again, about 51%. Colorado actually looked better into September, height of all the election argumentation, 66% of us expressed willingness, and the plurality wanted to get it as soon as possible. We also saw a difference by gender. We saw a difference by gender regardless of ethnicity, and we saw some difference by ethnicity, with whites generally being more willing than Hispanics and more willing than African Americans. You don't really see a white box on here, but whites were even higher than the general population. And that's likely to be, at least in part, attributable to the fact that Colorado's got a higher than median level of education among the residents in the state. And those, when you break out polling, it continues to show more highly educated folks are more willing. This is what it looks like to be distributing vaccine in Colorado, even as we speak. So vaccine got here Sunday, started getting distributed, shots started being given yesterday. We've got orange circles here, which is where the Pfizer shipments, 48,600 this week, went around the state. A couple in the metro area, but the planning tried to be as inclusive of our far-flung state as possible. The blue circles show the providers that are probably, even as we speak, giving vaccine yesterday, today, tomorrow, and probably Thursday. This is the slightly expanded phase 1 provider map. You've still got the same orange circles where the vaccine is stored, but now you've got at least one blue circle in every county. So we're really blessed in the metro area. We've got lots of providers of vaccines. Those are right now mostly hospitals, because the hospitals are going to be really focused big time on giving it to their workers. Health departments are included in that group as well. If you live in more rural parts of the state, you've got at least one spot in your county. But if you live in Los Animas, for example, pretty big county down there in the southern central part of Colorado, just one site in the county, at least right now, that's been registered as being a phase 1 provider. We're going to try to really heavily get folks to put into the Colorado Immunization Information System as rapidly as possible. Within 72 hours is mandated the administration of a vaccine. And that's both so we can track on it, but we also want to track on doses so they don't go to waste. I'm going to talk about cold storage in just a second. That's been a real challenge for these vaccines. And if lots get broken into or opened up and they're not being used, they need to be redistributed as rapidly as possible. The state is bending over backwards, as every immunization system does, to say, look, these are confidential. We're not going to share your personal health information, even with the federal government. There was a little bit of controversy over whether we ought to be providing CDC a little more information. And I think the state was able to be persuasive that providing a limited amount sufficient to look at national trends in coverage, but to not reveal personal health information was a better way to go. I've alluded to, so, I think you've all heard, this is tough stuff to store. It has to be really cold. So again, this is a novel type of vaccine platform. We've never had a messenger RNA-based vaccine given before. The vaccine is produced as a piece of spike protein, that's the coronavirus antigen, encoding messenger RNA inside a lipid nanoparticle. And that's the piece that helps it get processed, but that's also the Achilles heel because it's got to be kept really cold. So the Pfizer vaccine is shipped in these ultra cold containers. They can be stored 5 days in a fridge. They use pizza box style containers, which if you don't open them can be, they can maintain their temperature for approximately 10 days. They can also be replenished with dry ice. So you've got a little bit of leeway, but you do have to put in new dry ice about every 5 days or so. One of the challenges is these things come in pretty big shipment groups, 975 doses. I'm not sure where that number came from, but it means you've got to be in a place where you're going to be using a pretty good chunk of doses. You don't take one of these pizza boxes out to a nursing home, or probably not even out to a small rural county, and expect to use all 975. And so there's been a lot of thinking about how to make use of that. And frankly, because the Moderna vaccine ships at a lower, or rather not as challenging a temperature, it can be stored longer. And it also comes in smaller units, that it may be more amenable for more distant to release kind of places. I will note that the freezer criteria may change over time as we get more information. Pfizer's already modified its cold storage, making it somewhat more lenient. And frankly, as they just get more experience seeing what happens to these vaccines under different freezer conditions, we may see that loosen up even further, which of course would be good. I'll notice that another challenge is that for rapidity, these vaccines are packaged in multi-dose vials, 5 doses per vial for Pfizer and 10 for Moderna. And we don't have a lot of experience recently with multi-dose vaccines. Flu and polio are the only ones that are not single dose. So it makes the scheduling to avoid wastage. If you're going to open a vial of Pfizer, you want to be sure you got 5 people to give it to. And for Moderna, you got 10 people to give it to. I think everybody's aware that these are multi-dose vaccines. This is not your annual flu one shot. This is a 2-dose vaccine. Second dose is in 3 weeks for Pfizer, 4 weeks for Moderna. They are not interchangeable as far as we know. So tracking will be a whole lot more important, both for recalling people as well as the timing, as well as, most importantly, getting the same vaccine. As already alluded to, providers who've been pretty heavily vetted are going to have to use the information system SIS, and the state is going to be supporting forgetful vaccine recipients with reminder recall to say, hey, tomorrow's your day, don't forget, this is really important. I will note that there are other vaccines in the pipeline. I don't think we expect one before another 2 months. It may be the AstraZeneca vaccine, or it could be the Janssen vaccine. As we get more and more, there may be different parameters that, one may be more suitable for more rural locations. So one may be more suitable for elderly people, although both vaccines right now look pretty good in all the subgroups they've been looked at. And that may end up creating some stocking questions. Does every provider stock every vaccine, or do you just stock some vaccines? These aren't questions we've typically had to worry about and fuss over, but we will probably increasingly with the COVID-19 vaccines. There are still a number of pending issues. We've pretty much got the ACIP recommendations worked at least for adults 16 and above. Still pending are questions about kids and pregnant women. We hope the Moderna EUA is going to be processed with the same rapidity, or at least I do, assuming the data review looks good, which preliminarily this morning, it sounds like the FDA's review did look supportive. Hopefully this will happen in the same rapidity as the Pfizer doses. I think there's still some question about manufacturing capacity and amount. There was some news last week that the US had an option to buy more than 100 million doses of Pfizer, and we deferred. And now Pfizer's kind of got it, it's all booked up. It's being sold all over the world. And so it's not clear the US will get more than 100 million doses of Pfizer. And to vaccinate all of us, even if you subtract out kids, you know, you might need 275, 280 million doses times 2. And so we're going to need, if we only have 100 million Pfizer, we're going to need a lot of Moderna or some of these other vaccines to work. And they're going to not have to be manufacturing glitches, which can happen in all kinds of unexpected ways. Again, we may have questions over time about matching vaccines to target groups. There are already questions about what to do about previously infected people. Preliminary data from the phase 3 study suggests that they work as well in preliminarily infected people. That's good. One question is, do previously infected people actually need it, or can they go to the back of the line in the ICU? And they probably can if it doesn't get too logistically complicated, although we don't know how long natural immunity lasts. CDC currently says 3 months, but that's not based on a lot of longitudinal data. So that's an evolving question. There's very little testing that's gone on in kids. ACIP approved it down to age 16. It's notable that the only dissenting votes on the FDA approval of the EUA were among those who didn't think data in 16 and 17-year-olds was sufficient, and they were concerned about authorizing it for that group. Pfizer is enrolling kids down to 12, and Moderna is apparently either just started or about to start. There are no data in pregnant women because they always get neglected, although there's a big push to say this needs to end. ACOG has actually recommended that the vaccines be used in pregnant women. And right now, I think the FDA sort of punted and said, talk to your doctor about it, which is not very helpful if you're a doc who, I mean, what are you going to say? The FDA said, talk to your doctor. I'd have to say that we know that pregnant women are at higher risk. And although this is an untested product, it is unequivocally not a live virus. And if I was a doc tomorrow, I would be giving it pregnant women. There's a discussion about vaccine mandates. I think the government is leery of mandating it anywhere, you know, partly because of our anti-vax movement, but frankly, partly because we just don't know that much about the vaccines yet. So some employers are considering mandates. An employer, there have been a number of legal assessments that said that, yeah, they have the right to mandate it for employees if they wish to do so. We're not going to be able to chunk every other preventive measure, masks, et cetera. And so one open question is, what happens? Do people get even more mask fatigue? Do they burn their mask and have a celebration after they got their vaccine? Bad messaging plus, oh, by the way, we don't really know if these vaccines prevent transmission. The endpoints in the study were symptomatic disease. And so I think it's a major thing that we're going to be learning as to whether or not it's plausible they would, but we don't know that at this point in time. We're going to be working on you know, how do we best explain this to different groups, older people, younger people, populations from different ethnic backgrounds, probably by political party or at least by viewpoint of the world. Because again, we see such a major split by political persuasion in the polling. And then almost certainly we're going to discover stuff we didn't have a clue about, and then we are going to need to try to nimbly address on the fly. The the last thing I want to quickly say, or just point out to us, we hear a lot about herd immunity, and I'm an ID specialist, but I didn't know quite how to calculate herd immunity. And I'm a liaison to the National Vaccine Advisory Committee, and I heard a really good talk on it. So I thought I'd share it in case you're wondering too. And the formula quickly is 1 minus 1 over the R naught value, which for COVID is probably, in the absence of preventive measures, around 3. And if it is, then the herd immunity threshold would be 65%. And so when you get a 95% effective vaccine, you probably have to give it to about 70% or so of people, or you need 70% or so of people to be immune to get you to that number. It's worth pointing out that if you happen to be vaccinating in key transmission groups, if the vaccine does prevent transmission, which again is not proven at this point, you might be able to get away with a lower than 65% number. There's been some observations. I've talked to colleagues at Denver Health who told me that they were beginning to see what looked like a reduction in prevalence among their populations experiencing homelessness. And they didn't have any proof this was due to sort of micro niches of herd immunity, but it certainly was suggestive of that. On the other hand, even if you hit that herd immunity threshold, you can still have outbreaks. Look at measles last year, where nationally we had, 90+%, but we had pockets of unimmunized people. So this is part of the reason folks are saying, I think very appropriately, that COVID's not going to go away once we go through the middle of the summer. And then, of course, it depends not only on vaccine efficacy, but also duration of immunity. And so if the vaccine lasts like the HPV vaccine for, it looks like, at least a decade, that'll be fantastic. If it's, a couple of years, then we'll have to be thinking about revaccination. And then below this were just some hypothetical models of what it would show you about what you'd need. So a 90% effective vaccine needs that 70% coverage. And then the final point is that we're going to start seeing benefit from this even when we get way below herd immunity. It's estimated that by natural immunity right now, about 13% of Coloradans have been exposed to COVID. And those are being accounted for in our local School of Public Health's modeling efforts when they try to model numbers of hospitalizations over the next 6 weeks, because of the recognition that when you do get even some people immune, you can begin to see interrupted transmission. So I've probably gone too long, Victoria. Let me stop and let's see if Dr. Campbell is here.
Hi, hey, John, I'm here. Thanks for taking the lead today. I had some technical difficulties logging on. So let me share my screen.
While he's logging on, I'll say he's the man who needs no introduction, literally, just jumping right in. But this is Dr. Tom Campbell, who is the Chief Clinical Research Officer at UC Health and Associate Dean for Clinical Research at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, and a Professor of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Disease. So I squeezed in your intro, Tom.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. So I'm going to talk today about the background data, the theory, and then the data that we have from clinical trials leading up to the COVID vaccine development. I first want to start with just looking at what happens with natural coronavirus infection in humans. So there are 4 endemic human coronaviruses. They've been infecting humans for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. Everybody gets infected with all 4 of them at some point in their lifetimes. Seroprevalence for each of them is around 90–95%. For most people, they cause an upper respiratory infection, a common cold. And there have been some human experiments done where volunteers have been intentionally inoculated with some of these endemic coronaviruses in order to study the immune responses. And this is a paper, it was published in 1990, which incidentally is the year that I was a first-year ID fellow working under the mentorship of John Douglas at Denver Health. In this study, when these individuals were inoculated, 8 out of 10 or 10 out of 15 people were infected. 8 out of the 10 who were infected actually developed upper respiratory cold symptoms. The ability to get infected was correlated with lower baseline antibody levels. And then as they measured antibody levels shown in this serum IgG, shown in this lower panel, you can see that the people who got infected had lower antibodies, and they then spiked and came down over time. The people who didn't get infected remained fairly flat, and then by about a year later, they were at similar antibody levels. They then re-challenged 14 out of the 15 who were still willing to participate a year later with the same strain of human coronavirus. And 11 out of the 14 who were re-challenged got infected. But the cold symptoms were less common. Only 1 out of the 11 now had symptoms, and they had a shorter duration of viral shedding in the upper respiratory tract. Median viral shedding during the first infection was 5.6 days versus 2.0 days in the second infection. So I think these data are important because they show us what is potentially possible with SARS-CoV-2 if we can convert SARS-CoV-2 to behave more like an endemic human coronavirus by developing herd immunity, as John was mentioned in our populations. So how do we do that? Some people, not people in the medical community, but at least politicians have advocated for just letting it run its course and getting naturally acquired herd immunity. And as we know, we've just been experiencing the second wave of cases here in Colorado that's resulted in a wave of hospitalizations and deaths. And so if, I just did some rough back of the envelope calculations, and if we just let this run its course in Colorado, that it would take another year just to get 1 million confirmed cases. Granted, the number of actual cases is greater than the number of confirmed. But if the ratios of hospitalizations and deaths remain the same, that would result in over 50,000 additional hospitalizations and over 13,000 additional deaths. So acquiring herd immunity by natural infection would come with a very high cost, and I don't think anybody with any degree of reasonable sense would advocate for doing that. So I think what we need then is a successful vaccine, and the way that this vaccine would work, I've sort of sketched out here. There would be a couple of doses of the vaccine. There would be immune responses. I would expect that these immune responses would wane over time, but there would be memory cells so that at a later time point, if there was SARS-CoV-2 exposure, the immune response would kick in, and we would hope that there would be vaccine impacts. And the potential impacts of a vaccine would include preventing disease, preventing hospitalization, preventing mortality, and also preventing transmission to others. So I think there are important questions concerning candidate SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. A big one is which viral protein to target. Of course, we need to know if the vaccine is safe, both short-term and long-term. And in some infections, in viral infections, there is a phenomenon called antibody-dependent enhancement. Dengue is an example of that, where a weak immune response from a heterologous strain can lead to a more serious infection later on. And there is, issues of safety in special populations, pregnancy, children, immunocompromised people that John alluded to. An important question is, how do we define efficacy? Of course, we want to prevent SARS-CoV-2 infection, and that would be one way, but also preventing illness would be another. So, going back to the model of converting SARS-CoV-2 to an endemic coronavirus, If the vaccine didn't prevent infection, but prevented illness, then and illness is all mild, then that's still a success. We need to determine if the vaccine is efficacious, and particularly if it has efficacy in those greatest risk groups, particularly the elderly, racial and ethnic minorities, and immunocompromised individuals who we know are at the greatest risk for bad outcomes after SARS-CoV-2 exposure. And then importantly, how durable is the vaccine efficacy? So currently in the United States, there are 6 candidate vaccines that are either in or planned to be entering phase 3 clinical trials. These vaccines, sort of come down a funnel that start with 198 candidate vaccines worldwide, a total of 44 candidate vaccines in various stages of clinical trials worldwide, and these 6 phase 3 trials in the US. All 6 of these are represented here with sites in Colorado, but they differ in technology. The AstraZeneca and Janssen vaccines are adenovirus-based, AstraZeneca being chimpanzee adenovirus, Janssen or Johnson & Johnson being human adenovirus. Novavax and Sanofi are protein subunit, and Moderna and Pfizer, which are the ones we've heard the most about in the last month or so, as John mentioned, are mRNA-based. So AstraZeneca and Janssen are in phase 3 trials. AstraZeneca is close to finishing enrollment. Janssen is completing enrollment this week. Novavax hopes to begin enrollment either late this week or early next week. And there was a news release from Sanofi that because of decreased efficacy in terms of developing neutralizing antibody in older individuals in their phase 1, phase 2 studies, they are now redesigning things and hope to begin phase 3 in the second quarter of 2021. And Moderna, as I'll show you, the primary endpoint has been met and will be reviewed by the FDA for emergency use authorization on Thursday, so just in 2 days. And Pfizer, the primary endpoint is met, and as John has told you, it's EUA approved and is being rolled out. So I mainly want to focus the rest of the talk on the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, since these are the ones that are literally arriving or will soon be arriving in our hospitals and clinics. So I raised the question of which protein to target. All of the 6 vaccines in clinical trials, in the phase 3 clinical trials in the US, target the spike protein. So that's the protein on the surface of the virus. It's the protein that engages the ACE2 receptor on the host cell. And from what we know about other coronaviruses, it is the one that is most key or as a target for antibody neutralization. The RNA-based vaccines are messenger RNA. So what I've shown you here is the Moderna COVID vaccine that they call mRNA-1273. So it's RNA, it's made synthetically in the laboratory, it's made enzymatically, it's a cell-free production system. But what's different from most native RNA is that pseudouridine has replaced all of the uridine residues. But otherwise, it has a 5' cap, just like regular messenger RNA does. It's got an open reading frame for the COVID spike protein, and that's flanked by 2 untranslated regions and a poly A tail. So this is the same structure as most mRNAs in our cells have. What is different in the open reading frame is that 2 proline residues have been inserted in order to freeze the protein in an open conformation and make it more antigenically accessible. I'll show you something about that in just a minute. As John mentioned, both Pfizer and Moderna the RNA is lipid complexed. In the case of the Moderna vaccine, it's a ratio of 2.5 to 1 lipid to RNA. So most of what's being injected is actually lipid. And then there's some salt buffer, and Moderna adds sucrose for freezing stability. So I mentioned these two proline residues. So this is based on work that was actually conducted with the MERS coronavirus, the Middle East respiratory syndrome coronavirus. And this was published 3 years ago. But what is found is that in its native state, the spike protein exists in a closed conformation that's in an equilibrium with a partially open conformation. And that partially open conformation can bind to the cell receptor. The MERS cell receptor is a dipeptidyl peptidase, not ACE. And then after that binding, there's a conformational change that opens another binding domain. And so then a second binding event occurs, and that opens the third. And then there's 3 binding domains are open, and then that can lead to a fusion of the viral envelope with the host membrane. So what this 2-proline residue does is to stabilize the protein in this conformation where it's 2 of the binding domains are open and accessible, and 1 is not. And it's shown in animal models for MERS that this confers a greater immunogenicity and greater neutralizing antibody production and greater protection to the animals. So both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine have incorporated this 2-proline residues into their spike protein that's produced from the mRNA. And that's important because it's possible that these vaccines could actually be more immunogenic and more durable than the immunity that we get from natural infection. And some of that is shown in the phase 1 studies. So these are neutralizing antibody titers in the Moderna phase 1 study with various doses, increasing doses of 25, 100, and 250 micrograms. And you can see on the y-axis the neutralizing antibody titers. The important comparison here is on the right-hand side, and this is neutralizing antibody titers in convalescent plasma, so plasma from people who recovered from natural SARS-CoV-2 infection. And what you can see is that at the highest dose, the vaccine produced neutralizing antibody titers that were in the much more tightly grouped and in the top second or first to second quartile of titers for convalescent plasma. And then shown on the right graphs here are durability of antibody titers for the Moderna vaccine going out to almost 120 days. You can see that there is some decline in titer over time. The pattern and the magnitude are very similar for both younger and older age groups. So how do we assess vaccine efficacy? Well, there's a variety of ways it could be assessed depending on what we think the important measures are. We could look at vaccines to prevent infection. We could look at vaccines to prevent disease occurrence. We could look at vaccine preventing hospitalizations or preventing more severe hospitalizations, such as admission to intensive care unit. And of course, we could look at prevention of death and prevention of transmission. In clinical trials, what we measure is vaccine efficacy. And basically what vaccine efficacy is the proportionate reduction in whatever outcome we're measuring, any of those outcomes above. So the proportionate reduction in that outcome among the vaccinated group compared to the placebo group. Vaccine efficacy for other viruses is shown here, and there's a range. We have some very efficacious vaccines, such as hepatitis A vaccine that's in the 94 to 100% range. Varicella is also very good, whereas other things like flu is a little bit less good. In vaccine efficacy, as I said, is measured in clinical trials. Vaccine effectiveness is measured on a population level. And as John mentioned, that's something that we will be looking at as these vaccines are rolled out. So let's just jump to the data. So these are the data from the Pfizer phase 3 trial. So this was a phase 3 trial that enrolled 45,000 people, mostly in the US, but it also included sites in South Africa, Brazil, and Argentina. Participants were randomized one-to-one to receive either vaccine or placebo. It was double-blinded. And these are data, these are the vaccine efficacies reported in the New England Journal article that came out last week. And overall vaccine efficacy for the intention to treat population that had COVID occurring at least 7 days after the second dose in individuals who had no evidence of prior infection. So both the Pfizer and the Moderna trials excluded people who had known COVID illness. So documented COVID illness in the past was exclusionary. However, they did not test for baseline antibodies as part of study entry, although they have done that retrospectively now. So in this analysis, when those people with baseline antibodies were excluded, it was 95%. And then when they included the whole population, including the people with baseline COVID antibodies, the efficacy was essentially the same, 94.6%. And if you look here, there were, in the vaccine group, there was one case of someone who then had developed COVID, who had baseline antibodies, and there were 7 cases of people who had baseline antibodies and developed COVID in the placebo arm. Very small numbers, but if you use that as an estimate of vaccine efficacy in people with prior COVID antibodies, then that you could calculate a vaccine efficacy of 85%. Obviously, there's a huge confidence interval, width of a confidence interval around that, given the small numbers. But I think what it says is that at least for people who did not have bad enough COVID to get it medically diagnosed and either had asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic COVID, that the vaccine does still seem to provide some benefit. And then this is a very impressive graph of the cumulative incidence of COVID, of symptomatic COVID. So the primary endpoint in both the Pfizer and the Moderna studies are symptomatic COVID infection. And so this is the cumulative incidence of symptomatic COVID infection in the Pfizer study by placebo arm versus the vaccine arm. And you can see that, and this is days since getting the first dose. And you can see that beginning 10 days after getting the first dose, the placebo and vaccine curves start to diverge dramatically. Overall, as I said, vaccine efficacy is 95%. Prior to the second dose, vaccine efficacy was around 85%. So it's still very, very good. Oh, I'm sorry, it was 55%, still good, but not as good. And certainly we need the second dose. So what about Moderna? So on November 30th, they had a press release on their second interim analysis. And what they released was the information from the DSMB review. The DSMB that reviewed Moderna was actually an NIH-convened DSMB. They reviewed 196 cases of confirmed COVID illness. 11 of those cases occurred in the vaccine arm, 185 in the placebo arm, yielding a vaccine efficacy of 94.1%. An important secondary endpoint, which was severe COVID illness, there were 30 cases of severe illness in the placebo arm and 0 in the vaccine arms. There were no deaths in the study overall. So as we've mentioned, the Moderna vaccine is undergoing FDA review on Thursday. This is from the meeting summary document that was just posted on the FDA website this morning. The vaccine, and as you can see, the same type of Kaplan-Meier incidence curve that we looked at for the Pfizer study, with clear divergence from the placebo in blue versus the vaccine, beginning about, say, 20 days after the first dose. Important to point out that the time frame on the x-axis is almost identical to the graph that we saw for Pfizer, and the scale of the y-axis is also almost identical, with a little over 2% cumulative incidence over roughly 110 days. However, somewhat perhaps disappointingly, the overall vaccine efficacy now is being reported as 91.6%. So it's down 3% from what had been reported before. And this seems to be driven by a previously unrecognized difference in effects in age groups. So when they stratified vaccine efficacy by age group, it was 95.6% in people 18 to 65, but 86.4% in people 65 and over. In the Moderna study, 25% of the study population was 65 and over. So 86.4% is still pretty good vaccine efficacy, but that does raise some concern for this vaccine in older people. I haven't read all the details of this document yet, so I can't tell you anything more about that. In terms of safety, the primary safety issues appear to be vaccine reactogenicity. So these are systemic as well as local symptoms that occur 24 to 48 hours after getting the vaccine. And this nice slide that was posted on the CDC website summarizes both studies and compares them. You can see that fever, headache, and myalgia seem to be the main things, and fairly similar rates for both Pfizer and Moderna. So in summary, as of yesterday, I should have say as of today, Pfizer's EUA was approved and vaccine administrations have begun. They expect to produce 50 million doses globally before the end of the year and 1.3 billion more doses next year. Moderna, their EUA, as we've said, will be reviewed in 2 days. They expect to produce 20 million for distribution this year and another 0.5 to 1 billion in 2021. So I will stop there and I think John and I can take any questions.
Thank you very much, Tom and John. And we are also joined by Judy Schley, who is the Associate Director at Denver Public Health, and Anuj Mehta, who is the Assistant Professor of Medicine at Denver Health, University of Colorado, and National Jewish, and the chair of the Medical Advisory Group on Vaccine Allocation in Colorado. So I know we are at time, and I'm hoping that at least a couple of our or our 2 presenters and 2 panelists can stay on for 10 to 15 minutes. So with that hope out there, I will ask if anyone would like to unmute and ask a question, and I have a few lined up as well. So I'll give it a couple seconds. And I'll go ahead and start with one of the questions that came in about, we actually got a few questions in the chat about side effects. We got some questions about the risk in people with autoimmune disease, the risk of triggering autoimmune flares. What about people with a history of Guillain-Barré? And even sort of addressing where to find reliable information about the side effects of the vaccines, given what's going on in the media right now. And I'll open it up to any of the panelists.
Yeah, all I could say, Sarah, is we don't have good information on people with autoimmune disease. There were some included in the if you look in the supplementary information for the Pfizer vaccine from their New England Journal article, they do provide some information about that. But both trials excluded people who required significant immunosuppression. So anyone with a really serious autoimmune disease who was taking high doses of corticosteroids or biological agents was excluded from participation. So we really don't have good data. I'm not aware of either vaccine being associated with induction of autoimmune phenomena.
Yeah, this is Anuj. Thanks for having me on the panel. I think that the detailed report from Pfizer and Moderna, there were no issues with autoimmune disease. Granted, we don't have long-term follow-up. I think also that, you know, the Guillain-Barré with swine flu, the incidence was 1 in 100,000. So we're going to learn a lot more in the next week and a half, 2 weeks, as we see more and more people getting vaccinated. From the question of immunocompromised individuals, whether it's because of HIV or medications that they're taking, the ACIP Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices did weigh in on this and said they should be eligible. The only issue is not one of safety, but one of is it going to be as efficacious? And so that's a discussion for everybody to have with their medical team and physicians.
Yeah, and to that end, I would just ask, I know people with HIV were included in the trials. Do we know the sort of distribution of CD4 counts? Were there people with very low CD4 counts in the trials?
There were, I think, slightly under 200 individuals in the Pfizer trial that had HIV. I haven't reviewed the Moderna results yet, but they have not done any subgroup analysis on that. They didn't see any difference in side effect profile, but in terms of efficacy, it's such a small group that to really see any difference, I think that you probably wouldn't. And I don't think they're reporting that level of data. It was actually a late stage introduction into the trial to include individuals with HIV.
And they required that people be suppressed with relatively good CD4 count.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see what the efficacy is with folks with low CD4 counts. Another question that came in was about the time from vaccine to protection. And obviously it's going to vary between dose 1 and dose 2, but is there sort of a general answer to that question?
Well, I think from the Pfizer data, we know that protection starts as early as 10 to 12 days after the first dose. It's not as high as after the second dose, but there is substantial protection starting there, and then beginning, and that just increases from there. So it's important for everybody to get 2 doses. But we can expect to see some protection starting soon after the first.
The CDC just came out with, this is Judy, that full protection is about 1 to 2 weeks after completion of the second dose. So we'll have to wait a little bit on that. That's at least what the report said yesterday or Sunday. And I need to go. I apologize, Sarah. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks, Judy. Anyone else want to chime in with any other questions? I will mention another one that came up, and there was some discussion back and forth about folks in the lab. Are they 1A or 1B in terms of priority, at least in Colorado?
Do you mean in the research lab or in the testing lab?
I think testing lab.
Yeah, so we had a big discussion about that, and the goal is to prioritize them in 1A. Now, the difference between 1A and 1B is oftentimes going to be an on-the-ground decision because it's impossible to say based on any specific job description, whether somebody is going to be what their risk is. Some physicians may have very low risk if they're doing purely telehealth or a radiologist versus compared to hospitalists or ICU or primary care physicians. Same thing with nurse practitioners. So I think that the spirit of the recommendations is that if you're dealing with COVID samples, specifically, especially if you're involved in testing COVID samples, then you should be in 1A.
There was also sort of an interesting question about alcohol and substance use after the vaccines, and I can't remember exactly how that was worded. I think the concern was, are there any special concerns with alcohol and substance consumption after receiving the vaccines?
I'm not aware of any concerns, and I don't know that either clinical trial addressed that.
Okay.
I know that Pfizer lowered enrollment to age 12, but are there also plans to enroll pregnant women? Is that already in play?
I think that's, from my understanding, that's plans for 2021. So Pfizer dropped their enrollment age from 16 to 12 pretty late in the trial. So even the EUA doesn't contain any data for the 12 to 16 group. And the 16 to 17-year-old group was actually hotly debated during the VRB PAC meeting. So I think there will be trials in children and eventually in pregnant women. That being said, the ACIP recommendations are if a pregnant woman or a breastfeeding woman is in a high risk category, so a 1A healthcare worker or 1B healthcare worker or first responder, then it's a conversation with their physicians, and it should not be a categorical exclusion. For Pfizer, I suspect that they'll say the same about Moderna.
Thank you.
Marianne, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. And I'm sorry if I missed this. For Tom, is the Pfizer RNA molecule very similar, or is it all proprietary and they don't tell us about modifications? I wonder if it's more immunogenic with their modifications, if there are any, because they can give a lower dose at 30 micrograms versus 100.
Yeah, so the dosing, when we look at 30 micrograms versus 100, that's the mass of both the RNA and the lipid combined. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're giving less RNA, although it could. But they've provided less detail about how their RNA is constructed. It is very similar in overall design to the Moderna RNA. As I mentioned, it has the 2 proline inserts, and it's the full spike open reading frame, and it is a pseudouridine substituted. But that's all I know about the Pfizer RNA.
Thanks. So very similar, it sounds.
I think they would be very similar. Neither company has provided the full nucleotide sequence of their RNA.
Thank you.
Matthew Schultz, are you still on? And if so, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Howdy, yeah, thanks. I was just curious about the sort of underlying variabilities between folks that are, say, homebound versus those that are in the ICU, and how that was accounted for in the trials.
I think that's a great question. I think that was the goal of the randomization, was to, they couldn't regulate people's behaviors, that they weren't exposed to COVID. People encountered COVID, the coronavirus, through their natural kind of life course. And so the point of the randomization was to balance those that were homebound with those that were, potentially healthcare workers. And that level of detail hasn't necessarily been released in terms of specific occupations, but from an age, gender, demographic, ethnicity perspective, they were very well balanced. And I suspect that they would be balanced across those specific types of risk factors. That's the whole goal of randomization.
Yeah, and I would also add that both trials, the entry criteria included increased risk of SARS-CoV-2 exposure. So people who are just staying at home and not at risk for exposure would not have been eligible for the trial. We were a site in the Moderna study, and we specifically excluded people who didn't have, who were just staying at home.
Super helpful. Thanks so much.
We are running low on time, but one other question is sort of experience with mRNA vaccines. This is a newer vaccine technology. What are the precedents?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So even though these are the first mRNA vaccines to be put into widespread use, the technology has actually been in development since the late 1990s. So it's not totally new. And companies like Moderna have developed RNA-based vaccines for other viral infections, including cytomegalovirus, influenza, RSV, I believe, Ebola. They never got those vaccines to phase 3, not for any safety reasons, but I think just because of where they were in the marketplace for some things like influenza, which are very common, and for instance with Zika, Zika went away, and so there wasn't much need for a vaccine. So I think that the technology was there, the numbers of people, and they did conduct phase 1 and phase 2 studies. Probably less than 1,000 people total received RNA vaccines prior to these COVID studies, but there at least is some longer term data amongst that smaller number and no safety signals that I'm aware of.
In addition to that, RNA technology has been used for other types of therapies like cancer therapies. And again, part of the issue has been efficacy. The lipid molecule that's included in both of the mRNA vaccines protects the mRNA from degradation in the system so that it could actually enter the cell. And that type of technology is what I think is relatively newer. So I know that there were trials of sense and antisense RNA-based technologies in cancer in the 2000s, and they were just found not to be efficacious. But there were no long-term safety issues.
And the final question I'll just pull from the chat. Ashley Ba, do you want to unmute and ask your question if you're still on?
I don't think she's on anymore.
Okay. Her question was about how long the protection is expected to last after having illness or after receiving the vaccine. I know it was covered in the presentation some, but if there's any other comments about that.
We don't know for the vaccine for sure. So we'll find out.
Right. Well, thank you both very much, and also thank you to John and Judy who've already left. Victoria, any closing things I need to cover?
Just a couple quick reminders. I did paste the link to our website in the chat where you can access our resources. The evaluation link again is in there. I will also email it to you all for attending today. Our next session is going to be in a few weeks actually, to take a little break for the holidays. So our next session will actually be June 5th, the same time, 7:30 a.m. Mountain Time or 8:30 a.m. Central Time, and that'll be covering special populations. So we look forward to seeing you then, but you are welcome to reach out to me or Caroline if you have any questions or comments in the meantime, but we'll see you all in a few weeks.
All right, thanks again. January 5th. See you then.
January 5th, yes.
Bye.